Good evening. Let's continue our discussion on the question of reality. Let's try to focus more on its complex and problematic nature, in order to better highlight its two characteristics. It is absolutely crucial to understand that the question of reality is complex and problematic, which could motivate a person to embark on a comprehensive search for reality. Let's consider this figure, where the question of reality is described as a multi-level system. Moving from one level to another requires a more self-critical, reflective, open, and comprehensive awareness and way of thinking. Let's start with the first level, which is the physical, biological, mental, and social world. To answer ontological questions about our world, everyone evokes and appeals, explicitly or implicitly, to their worldview, which may be religious, philosophical, or scientific. This worldview is, of course, considered to be true. So, to an ontological question, the person's worldview offers an answer, and that's that. Ontological questioning, of course, stops at this level. This is generally the case, but if the person adopts a more open, self-critical, and reflective consciousness, they will notice the existence of several worldviews, as illustrated in this figure. Indeed, humans agree on the presence of a single, universal reality, but they differ in their identification and description or conception of this single, universal reality. In fact, there is a multitude of divergent and conflicting religious, philosophical, and scientific worldviews, as illustrated in this figure. Let us now return to the previous figure, where the question of reality is described in terms of several levels. What we actually see is that we have different worldviews that are conflicting, open to criticism, and generally problematic. At this stage, the person's focus may shift from the first level to the second level, from the level of the physical world to the level of worldviews. The person will then ask themselves ontological questions about worldview as a psychological and sociological component. What is the nature, content, organization, function, and origin of worldviews? Etc. And of course, at this stage, the person will realize that worldviews are produced by ontological sources such as religion, philosophy, science, etc. We then find ourselves in the same situation with ontological sources. A person generally claims that they adopt their worldview because it is dictated by a particular ontological source, which is considered to be true. Full stop. And so the ontological questioning stops there. But if the person adopts a more open, self-critical, and reflective consciousness, they will notice the existence of several ontological sources that are different, conflicting, and problematic, in the same way as worldviews. There are indeed disagreements between ontological sources and disagreements within the same ontological source, whether at the level of religion, philosophy, or science. And there are also different conceptions of ontological sources. For example, a religious person's conception of religion is different from a materialist's or an atheist's conception of religion. So, at this stage, the person's focus can also shift from the second level, which is the level of worldviews, to the third level, which is the level of ontological sources, the world of ontological sources. Here too, the person will ask ontological questions about ontological sources as psychological and sociological components. The person will then realize that the ontological source, such as religion or philosophy or science, is a specialization of the human mind, both individual and collective, and also a specialization of consciousness, reason, etc. They are thus able to move on to another level or another world, if you will, that of the human. And so the circle is complete. We find the human being we encounter, of course, in the first level, which is the level of the physical world. All this shows the complex and problematic nature of the question of reality. So, indeed, there is definitely a problem here, a major ontological problem, because the different worldviews of the same and unique reality cannot all be accurate and true. So necessarily, if there is one worldview that is correct, the other worldviews, which are different, are necessarily false, and so on. Faced with this very problematic situation, there are essentially three human attitudes. There is the attitude of closed, egocentric consciousness, which asserts that the question of reality is not problematic. The question does not pose a problem. Why? quite simply because such a person judges their worldview to be the correct one, and other worldviews, which are different from their own, are necessarily false. Period. The second attitude is that of the skeptical and agnostic consciousness, which asserts that the question of reality is an unsolvable problem, because when we look at the history of humanity, there have always been different worldviews, and we feel like we are going around in circles. And so, in fact, for the skeptical consciousness, it is better to ignore the question of reality and focus on something else. And very often, we will be interested in a pragmatic philosophy, which concerns our everyday world, with all its problems. Finally, there is the attitude of open and spiritual consciousness, which fully recognizes the problematic nature of the question of reality and does not make any a priori decisions. So, a priori, for this consciousness, we have a problem, and therefore we must solve it, of course with an open and spiritual consciousness. Thus, each person is called upon to choose their attitude towards the question of reality. Within the framework of this channel, Search for Reality, I suggest that you adopt an open and spiritual consciousness that recognizes the problematic nature of the question of reality and commits to treating it as such. The next episode will present various additional reasons, beyond the problematic nature of the question of reality presented here, which prompt open and spiritual consciousness to embark on a comprehensive search for reality, a search that naturally covers all levels of the question of reality, the reality of the physical world, the reality of worldview, the reality of ontological sources, consciousness, and humanity. Thank you for your attention, and see you next time.